I'm so happy to see you all. Thank you all for being here. I'm Eddie Torres. I wanted to say thank you for being here. Welcome to Grantmakers in the Arts 2023 Conference, GIA Multiverse, Revisiting Past to Build the Future. This is our summer series. This is our second summer session, and we're thrilled that you've all been able to join us. I'm Eddie Torres. I'm President and CEO of Grantmakers in the Arts. I'm an older cisgendered male with brown skin, dark hair and eyes, a white beard and glasses. I'm coming to you from unceded land of Lenape-Hoking. I am on the unceded land of the Lenape-Munsee people. The title of today's session is No Art Without Artists, but Where is the Funding? Before we get into the content, a few housekeeping items. Please take a moment to review our conference guidelines on how to convene. We're going to put those in the chat so you can all access them. Also, the sessions are being recorded and they're going to be made available to the hundreds of folks who have registered for this conference. If you have any technical issues during the presentation, you can reach out directly to Tech Ali and Jessica, and they will assist you. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions to our presenters. If you'd like your experience to include live captioning, select the closed caption or CC feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitles. For some versions of Zoom, it'll say captions. So today we're going to hear from Molly Flanagan, she, her, from Rhode Island State Council on the Arts. She, Ri, Aku, Rivera, Rios, they, them, artist. Kathy She, she, her, City of Seattle, Office of Arts and Culture. Ruby Lopez Harper, she, her, Craft Emergency Relief Fund, Surf Plus. Also council member, Maryland State Arts Council. With that, I'm excited to pass over the mic to Molly Flanagan to get us started. Molly.
Hi, everyone. I'm so delighted that you're here. I'm going to start with just talking at you for about 3 minutes about the problem, and then we'll jump into a really engaging conversation. Here we go. The enabling legislation of the National Endowment for the Arts states, while no government can call a great artist or scholar into existence, it is necessary and appropriate for the federal government to create and sustain not only a climate encouraging freedom of thought, imagination, and inquiry, but also the material conditions facilitating the release of this creative talent. Between the National Endowment for the Arts' first year of grantmaking, 1966 and 1994, they awarded over 11,000 grants to artists. Some of the artists that received these grants have gone on to become household names, at least in my household, artists like Wynton Marsalis and Louise Erdrich. Most of them didn't. These artists live across the country. They live in tiny rural towns. They live in so-called flyover states, on reservations, in our very underserved and often forgotten about territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Northern Mariana Islands, and yes, in New York and LA too. A qualitative report on the impact of the NEA's grants to individuals that they released in October 1993, not a lot going on for the NEA then, you know, that was a joke, reminds us of something we all know deeply. Quote, audiences in every corner of the country have reaped the benefits of the endowment-supported explosion of creativity and diversity. Most of our grantees have committed themselves to working in their communities. They teach at universities, run art museums, record documentaries for radio and film, start dance companies and theaters, open workshops for other artists, and help children discover creativity. Called to the arts, they are not in it for the fame or the money. Yet their work lodges in our imagination, pricks our consciences, delights and puzzles and overwhelms us. As we know, that all came to an abrupt halt in 1994. And in the same way that the creation of the NEA spawned state and local arts agencies, they used NEA dollars for their own grants directly to artists. State and local government also, funding for artists also slowed to a trickle. The system of artist fellowships, which still exists in about half of state arts agencies across the country, became a luxury of states that are lucky enough to have more than just the NEA match as their budget from the state legislature. In fiscal year 2020, only 3.6% of the grant dollars from state arts agencies went directly to artists. For the NEA, that number is less than 1%. For the duration of this conversation, I encourage you to remember that none of the work we do as a field exists without artists. That our work as arts administrators and funders is in service of art and artists. That we want to ensure that as a nation, our art makers are as diverse as our residents. Equity and diversity are not something that's extraneous, it's really the core of this. And that together we can create a future where artists are valued. And since we live in capitalism and money is the way that we assign value, I mean a future where artists get paid. I want to welcome 3 brilliant artists and arts administrators and ask them each to briefly introduce themselves. And Ruby, let's start with you.
Hello. My notes, because technology is such a saucy minx, are back. So thank you. Yo soy Ruby Lopez Harper. I'm the executive director of the Craft Emergency Relief Fund, commissioner for the Maryland State Arts Council, adjunct professor at George Mason University, teaching arts and community engagement, advocacy chair on the board of the Arts and Humanities Council of Montgomery County. I'm a mom, a wife, daughter, aunt, sister, needle crafter, dancer, photographer, poet. I'm third generation American con raíces in Michoacán, Mexico. I'm brown skinned, abled, cisgender female using the pronouns she, her, ella. My dark brown curly hair is pulled into little side buns. And today I'm so excited to be here. I think, just a little bit on the idea of my passion for supporting individual artists has been at the core that, if we subscribe to this idea that everyone gets to live a full life of their choosing, that has to include everyone, and that everyone includes artists. And so I think from as far back as my early days in philanthropy in the corporate environment, understanding and being cognizant of the value of unlimited, unrestricted dollars and getting, funds into the hands of individuals. And even if it was small amounts, those small amounts matter when you're talking about one person. So, yeah, I think that gets us started. Thanks, Molly.
Yeah, Kathy, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Sure. Kathy Sheh, she, her pronouns. I'm calling in from the land of the Coast Salish, specifically the Duwamish here in Seattle, Washington. I am an Asian American woman with dark black hair, brown eyes, long, wavy, and I'm standing in front of a backdrop of my office at second floor or third floor of a King Street station here in Seattle. And I am the cultural investment strategist for the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, but I am also a theater artist. And my childhood, I was fortunate enough to through a wide variety of circumstances, be exposed to a wide variety of arts. So have been a practicing artist in many, many forms since childhood. And my love for artists is actually what brought me to this job at the City of Seattle. And I concur with everything Ruby said. The arts are our expression of our humanity. They are how we express and reflect and basically be human. And in every culture in the world, arts is part of that culture in such a deep way. And only here in the United States have we so commodified it that we've kind of separated that out. And so every human being is actually an artist, and really looking at different ways that we can really sustain that in how we change our systems so that we can continue to support artists at the heart of who they are. Is what excites me about coming to work every day.
Shay, take us away.
Hola a todos, Taigüey Taino. Hello, everyone. I'm Shay Riacu Rivera Rios. I am born and raised in Boriquén, Puerto Rico, and have been living in Providence, Rhode Island, land of Narragansett and Wampanoag people for about 13 years now. Building community here, and I consider myself a person of a diaspora, like I belong to a diaspora, like many of us probably, and in this space, where our hearts are grounded and rooted in multiple locations. So definitely walking a path of supporting and being part of various communities across geography, including in my homeland, Boriquén, and in my dear home of Providence, Rhode Island. So I'm an artist primarily. I'm in this space as an artist. Thank you, Molly, for inviting me. Ruby and Kathy, so great to be in this space with you both. I also have a background in arts administration, so tapping into a little bit of my knowledge, but stepping in fully as an artist primarily. I work in performance. I truly believe performance is a healing practice. We can get into that in another time. And also do visual artwork and a lot of what we call nowadays socially engaged practice, which really is just us living in our communities and bringing our gifts and collaborating with folks across sectors and across identities. I am a brown and light-skinned gender non-conforming person. I use they, them pronouns, or ella in Spanish. I'm an abled person with long dark hair and glasses. I'm mixed race, Boricua, with Taino descendancy. And yeah, I'm an artist, cultural worker, and artist administrator in this space. Thank you so much for having me.
And I realized that I was so excited to talk about artist funding that I forgot to introduce myself. So hi, I'm Molly Flanagan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a cisgendered, relatively generic looking white woman with glasses, and I embrace it, y'all. I feel good about my generic lookingness, and it is being a white generic looking person gives me power in ways that is good. Anyway, just acknowledging that. So I'm a generic looking white woman wearing glasses. My hair is short and wavy and is sort of a mixture of pink and brown. And I'm in front of a bunch of artwork in my home office in Central Falls, Rhode Island, which is the home of the Narragansett and Wampanoag people. And I am the director of artist programs at the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts. And I am what I call myself a retired artist. I had a decade-long career in the performing arts before I moved to arts administration. And I believe that my life's work is to work towards a place where artists are valued and celebrated and able to live lives where they can create their best work, which is fed by money, because money means safety and housing and food and art supplies. So that's what I'm doing here. So we're gonna launch in, y'all. So my first question is gonna be to all three panelists, but I'm gonna start with Ruby first. What does public funding directly to artists look like nationally right now? And what does it look like in your city and state?
Yeah, so it sounds so cliche, but it's such a mixed bag of nuts, right? That you've got some states that are really focused on providing, the unrestricted support. So fellowships, whether it's straight funding or funding with complementary programming. I think, there's still a lot of work out there for individual artists, especially in the arena of public art commissioning. So you see that a lot of that at the local level. Has anybody really, I think, figured out how to navigate the government restrictions to deliver funds into the hands of individuals? It's a challenge, right? And I think, what we see is that states and localities are being very creative. So, I remember talking with Jen Cole when she was at Metro Arts in Nashville, and, they utilize a contracting process that allows them to deliver funds. But it's all still very restricted in that it's, project grant. It's, kind of focused on case by case, situational, transactional. One of the things that I think was really interesting that came out of the pandemic conversation was the guaranteed basic income structures. And there is a website, and I neglected to pull it, so I'll find it and I'll post it in the chat before our session is over, that tracks the pilot projects across the country. I think there were like over 100 different programs at all different levels that were testing different amounts of guaranteed basic income programs. And so I think that's been an interesting, new approach to getting dollars in the hands of artists. What does it look like in Maryland? I think, it's kind of the same, I think, as everywhere else, trying to figure it out. But, there's an apprenticeship program that the Maryland State Arts Council runs that I think is a really interesting form of supporting individual artists, where they pair, kind of mentor artists with newer artists that are trying to deepen their experience and their practice. And then, at the Humanities Council in Montgomery County, there's, the public art funding. There is funding for artists that are doing work, I believe, in the school system. So, there's different ways for artists to access funds, but I think it continues to be a challenge in terms of density, that no artist could spend their time, being funded through grant programs, because there's so much work involved in just trying to get the grant, let alone, oh, thank you, Eddie, for putting that in the chat. So the density, like, how do we maximize the dollars that we have available in order to provide the offset that if we are able to gift individual artists with these funds in order to be able to focus on the work that they're creating without having to have 3 other jobs and a side hustle and all these things, we're enriching not just that individual's livelihood and the quality of life that they're able to experience, but we're also then giving them the time, energy, and resources in order to give back to the community that they reside in. The last thing that I'll share too, I think, specifically around disaster relief, which is the work that the Craft Emergency Relief Fund is focused on, really working to break down barriers to access. And so how quickly can we get applications in, funds out? Can we do direct deposit? Can we do, what are all the fast ways we can do it? And still recognizing that there are a lot of barriers to that access that exist across the country, and then get further exacerbated depending on what type of geographic or ethnic community that you're working with. In particular, we've been working with the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums, and finding the lack of resources and consistent access to technology in tribal communities is still a very current issue that we're dealing with in terms of trying to figure out, what support do you provide that is going to be the most helpful, and how do we be responsive in the way that, communities organize for themselves, and where we can deliver and direct those dollars.
Yeah, I'm from Arizona, where there's a large quantity of indigenous reservations. And one of the points I make a lot about technology and access and how we're reaching folks is that there is a tribe that lives in the Grand Canyon, and how hard it is to support, and how vital it is to make sure that federal and state resources are reaching, and that their artistic traditions and contemporary work is supported. But how hard is it to make sure that there's internet access on the floor of the Grand Canyon? So yes, that's important. Kathy, again, what does public funding directly to artists look like nationally and locally right now?
nationally, I will say that uh, I just want to build on what Ruby said, but when the NEA stopped funding individual artists, unfortunately, I think that led to a trickle down where a lot of other, the NEA's kind of set the precedence for how a lot of arts funding has happened in our country. And when they decided no longer to fund artists, that made a lot of, especially government agencies around the country, follow suit. And then when new ones are established, they never kind of set up the individual artist funding. And I saw locally, I'm old enough where I saw what happened locally when that happened. There were a lot of government agencies that used to fund individual artists, and they actually cut that program partly, especially at the state level, because every dollar that they get is actually matched by the NEA. And so that was a sad precedence. Locally, though, what happened partly because of that is we actually have a couple of organizations that were set up and created specifically to fund individual artists that are nonprofit organizations. So we at the city, we've always had an individual artist funding program, but I will say that it is sadly, because of some of these government restrictions, one of our smaller programs. So what we've had to do is find creative ways to work around that. So at the City of Seattle, some of the deepest investments, we've actually, in the last 10 years, really established a precedence of doing artist residencies in city government. So we have artists in residence with the Seattle Department of Transportation. We have this unique bridge residency where we have these local public bridges, and we've actually created opportunities in partnership with other city departments to establish artists in residence at those bridge sites. Based on the proposals they submit. We have artists in residence with the Office for Civil Rights, one with the Seattle Public Library. And so we do this as a way to actually give living wages for artists to be able to use their creativity to address issues that they're actually passionate about. That's the beauty of artists. They are not just artists for art's sake. Many are, and that is fabulous. But there's also so many artists who are exploring the huge ideas that we at city level are grappling with, the environment, racism, so many things, and they are able to use their creativity using their art and helping to address these. And we're able to actually create these partnerships with other city departments. We're able to pay them decent wages to be artists exploring the ideas that they want to. So that's probably one of the most exciting programs that I think our office has really been working on the last decade. We also partner with some of those local nonprofits where their sole purpose is to give money to artists. And we are more easily able to fund those organizations. So especially during the pandemic, a lot of our relief funding went directly to those intermediaries. And then we realized also there's some racial inequities in the community. So what we specifically did was sought out new intermediaries who Indigenous ones in the Asian community, ones in the Black community, ones in the Latinx community, and we're able to invest in them deeply. And they were basically willing and able to give out the money all directly to artists. So that is another strategy that we've been using. And then we actually changed some of our organizational funding programs. I think a lot of arts funders in the country will only fund nonprofits or ones that have a fiscal sponsor. Many years ago, over a decade ago, I saw some of the inequities, especially in BIPOC and immigrant communities around that. And in order to get money directly to artists in those diverse communities, I started noticing that there were a lot of artists, because of this structural system, status quo in our country, we're forming LLCs or sole proprietorships where they are a single artist, but in order to get access to some of those funds, they've had to establish kind of a business around them. And so we changed our funding program so that we allow for individual artists who have set themselves up as sole proprietors to be able to apply for organizational funding. And so I love the fact that our most recent round of funding we had a significant increase of artists, especially BIPOC ones, who fit in that model. And that was a way we were able to fund individual artists significantly. And they actually got some of the largest awards, more than some of the big institutions here in Seattle during that round, because we also changed our criteria. So those are just some of the strategies that we've been using to get dollars directly to artists. We also, I just want to say, we do also have a Hope Corps model, which is like a WPA model that we were able to establish during the pandemic. And so that's another way just to get dollars out to pay artists to be artists.
That's amazing. Shay, let's hear from you.
I feel so much hope right now. Thank you, Ruby and Kathy. I just feel like I'm entering this space as an artist 100%. I love what you mentioned, Kathy, about many of us have had to start, well, we're sole proprietors or have had to start our LLCs. A lot of us have done that big migration into getting our work structured that way. And it's part of like what we have to do in terms of figuring out alternative structures to survive when we're not employed by nonprofits. So, you know, I have a trajectory of being employed by nonprofits. Now I'm an independent worker. The piece that stands out to me in this whole conversation, and I really appreciate, Molly, that you held space for this topic, because it's so important and nonstop. I say all the time, I'm going to keep talking about it until people get sick of me. But it's like trusting the artists to know what they're doing, trusting that artists have value intrinsically, and how hard it is for institutions to do that. Like the most basic thing. It's like you're supposed to invest in brilliance and in creative practice and in cultural revitalization or just cultural energy, but then you still refuse to trust the artists to actually do this work is a massive disconnect to me, and it's reflected in funding. So I really am very excited to see more move toward funding independent artists, and also just like the recognition and respect that many of us are our own businesses. We are our own creative cultural hubs. When we receive funding, many of us support tons of other people with that funding. You know, I try to talk to folks in terms of economic development. We really need to rethink what that means, because we are cultural workers. We are part of a whole ass economy that we've developed with many partners, but oftentimes with our own blood, sweat, and tears to get resources to communities that often don't have those resources, and to communities who have incredible people doing incredible work, often not resourced or with very limited resourcing. So really understanding that artists and culture bearers are these like little hubs, and we are, you know, if we get, like, for example, if I get a grant of, let's say, $6,000, and I tell people about this when we're talking about our impact as artists, track how many artists did you pay? How much money went to artists? How many creative businesses did you support? To show our cultural impact. You know, it's real. We have to show those things, because ultimately we do live in this world, and we are trying to build sustainable systems to build wealth, like in ways that are healthy and connected with community, you know, and also that doesn't mean that we're being capitalists. I want to honor that, because there is a lot of really incredible work to rethink the work that we do, especially the folks doing solidarity economy work over in Massachusetts with Art Co-op, and just helping us understand how artists have been building these alternative systems that build reciprocal exchange with community. But just that piece of trusting an artist, and especially to the point that you both shared, Ruby and Kathy, already, in terms of equity. You know, equity is very performative in many institutional cases, unless you put very specific operationalized ways to support artists and to address the gaps in understanding class divide, racial and gender divide, and also, you know, generational wealth. You know, all of us artists, we're not the same. Some of us have been blessed to have a little bump up to be able to do our work. Some of us come from a lot of bump ups, and some of us come from like, we just, you know, from our own skin, like working together with community to create beautiful things, making de tripas corazones, how we say in Puerto Rico. With little, we make a lot. So, I often tell people it's so funny to me when institutions think about investing in us as individual artists as a risk. When I tell you, it's like, especially BIPOC artists and queer and trans artists, we are the most exceptional because we just have had to make ends meet in often facing insurmountable odds, and instability and questions around sustainability. So how could, like, to me, that's like very conservative investment, is like, you give us money, we're gonna go above and beyond. But also we shouldn't have to, there's this whole, this is the last piece I'll say. I'll say two more things. In Rhode Island, there's a lot of really beautiful things happening. I'm really excited about Molly. Todd is another person at RISCA that have added a lot of good energy to really being available to community, to helping folks, understand the granting systems, and also to change that, because now we have GOS for artists. And while it's like very limited, I really hope it grows, because it's a game changer to have artists apply to a grant to get $6,000 per year for 3 years. Needs to be bigger. Rhode Island needs to do better. And then in our arts and culture department in Providence, there's been a really wonderful legacy of work that has been created by a lot of folks that were in that office, in terms of connecting to what you were saying, Kathy, seeing the power of artists across sectors, in education, in healthcare work, in racial justice, in climate justice, and like really understanding that when you invest in artists, you're really investing oftentimes in a bigger scale in our community. So just really landing that. There's some really interesting ways I've seen. I was in Denver not too long ago with Redline Contemporary Arts. They have the Insight Fund. So that's the Andy Warhol Foundation has been seeding some folks to do regranting. And then in Providence, we have one of those institutions through the Wedding Cake House, an artist space that runs the Interlace Fund. What was exciting about the pandemic, a lot of terrible things happened in the pandemic, right? Unfortunately, it took that to like get people to understand that we can use mutual aid funding structures, and that are rooted in just like the understanding that we all deserve to live and have health and have a good quality of life. And we have emergencies, and just to eliminate the barriers to get money to people. That was a big learning. I really hope we don't forget those learnings. I just love hearing you, Ruby and Kathy, speak to the work that you're doing, because it gives me hope. Because, oftentimes artists is like, we know there sometimes is forward motion on certain things, but we never take that for granted, because it could easily backtrack, right? Especially in the political climate in which we live in today. Let me see. Last thing I'll say is it's specifically in Rhode Island, and I'm sure this happens in other communities, there is still a ceiling of funding where like it doesn't seem like we can get past like, grants that are between 5 to maybe 10,000 equidao and almost, but it's like there's not a lot of pools of money for artists to access more money like that, especially people who really want to scale up their work. So I see, folks in Massachusetts, there's like incredible grant opportunities of like $20,000 to $30,000 to run projects and do your work. Can we look into those models as well and build relationships and alliances that allow us to allow all these institutions that are funding to like really, push up the artwork, like, support the artists' work. The other thing is how we talk about impact in the art sector. Like, y'all, so tiring and exhausting. Like if I one more time, Molly has probably witnessed me in spaces when it's like, when people say that the role of the arts is to bring people to hotels and restaurants, I just come out with my machete, like just, turn tables. It's like, no, that's not how we should be measuring the impact. The impact, as we all know, it's deeper. We are, agents in our own communities, building economies. And, that needs to be understood as what the arts and artists bring to the table, more from a people-centered perspective rather than from a development perspective. So that's what I got for that question, because I love it.
Y'all, I can't with the amount of brilliance in this Zoom room. Okay, next question. Okay, this one's a good one. And Kathy, this is for you. beyond the culture wars that led to these major changes in what the NEA funds and the NEA's total appropriations, how did we get here? What impact, I know, Kathy, you mentioned the impact of the NEA restrictions on their fund and the impact that's having on state and local arts agencies. What are the other factors beyond the NEA funding and NEA funding restrictions that have led to artists being undervalued and under or unfunded? It's a hard, big question. Kathy, take us
Yeah, and
away.
I'm going to approach it from a philosophical perspective. From my noticing, and like I said, I've been an artist my entire life, is really this capitalistic structure that our country, our young country, as the United States of America, not pre that, but specifically the capitalism that our country has embraced, is what I think led to it. So I mentioned this before, where I really think in our country we have so commodified the arts that it as a commodity, then you're either at a level where you can be a quote unquote professional artist. And that has led to this huge stratification. So in the perception of a lot of, if you just go to any person on the street and ask them what they think of artists, a lot of people on the street think of artists as those exceptional few that have the big name, are getting the big bucks, and therefore they think, why are they getting that much money for that celebrity status, right? When there's so many working artists who are doing so much good in terms of everything that Shay was talking about, health and wellness, mental well-being. I mean, we saw it during the pandemic. So many artists were using their strengths and expertise to support the whole rest of the community, even as they were not getting an earned income. The value that artists play in our everyday lives has always been the center of each community. But we've kind of separated that. You either have to be at this level or that. And so anyway, most people in community only see the big visibility of the celebrity status. So they already think artists are being overpaid in that sense. So that is part of the issue. And the reality is that I'll give a data point. About 15 years ago, there was, maybe it was around 2000, there was this huge study that was done. And the results of it were people were asked to evaluate like how they valued artists. And then they're also asked to evaluate like how they valued art. People in this country valued art. They rated that very high. They love their music. They love their books, films, participating in arts, singing, etc. But then the rating for artists was so low. Like they didn't understand why, paying that extra amount for the musician to get royalties from their own music was important. Yet they were spending thousands of dollars to outfit their home with these big stereos and speakers and all these things, but they were frustrated having to pay that little bit of royalty to be able to access the music that actually went directly to the artist. And in the study, it was really depressing seeing that there's a disconnect in our country between people understanding that all of the art that they love and appreciate is created by these human beings. And I to be honest, I've been grappling with this question for 2 decades now, trying to understand how so many people in our country don't understand the human person that creates this art that they so value, and that they actually in these studies show that they don't value artists. And I think again it has to do with that capitalistic mindset of we want our things, but we and it translates into everything right now with the whole writers' strike and the SAG strike. We see like people want to be able to have access to all of the things, but they, so Netflix, that's okay because that's how they get access, but they don't understand that at the end of that is the artist that actually created all of that stuff. And again, I think it's because we've completely separated the humanity that art originates from, and we've commodified it to an extent where people forget that it took a human being to create this, and we have to bring that schism back together, because that's actually going to lead to a world that is not going to be very, very pretty.
Ruby and Shay, any thoughts about that? But Danielle, I had goosebumps also.
I think really quick, the thing that I'll add is that, you know, it's structural too, right? That the way that we support arts and culture in our country is not designed in the same way. I mean, say all the things and have all the feelings about Europe, but the way that they support and center the arts in their infrastructure is not the way that we do it. And I think that that's always been dissonant in how we think about it. And a lot of the movements, you know, not to poo-poo on the education system, because I think the education system has its own set of challenges and its own value, you know, proposition that it's struggling with. But when we took arts education out and we have diminished its place, that was the beginning, right? That if you that children are learning and being exposed to, and so then they have what they have in their homes, right? So when I think about where and how arts and culture showed up, it is part of my everyday life versus when somebody asked me, when did you start, you know, when did you start in the arts? And I was like, well, I guess I started when I started taking dance classes, but no, it precedes that and precedes that and precedes that. And I think even in, you know, the non-Western cultures, how we value art and how we interact with art and what it means and its place in that conversation also creates challenges in how we place value on it, right? That if you know certain cultural practices are just part of your everyday life, it's then even more challenging to want to contribute monetarily towards it. Or why would you pay that artist but then not pay your, you know, aunt that's doing the same thing in her living room? Like, there's distances that I don't know how we cross those divides. But I also think that there's a level of you know, the downplay of it, the stigma of being a starving artist. Like, we've created a narrative, and while I feel we've done some really strong work in terms of the economic you know, the economic effect of arts engagement and how, you know, the arts contribute towards a stronger economy, we've never really leaned into or been able to cross the divide of why art on a day-to-day experience is valuable and important, and also you know, part of the work that we do. I remember I was in a conversation and the arts were being talked about as a resource. Well, a resource is used, and you know, it's finite, and it's a possession. It's not necessarily it by itself doesn't necessarily have value. But if we think about the arts as assets, does that change the way we start thinking about the way we provide resource to the arts? Does it change the way we start thinking about its place in the portfolio of the things that we value and put a priority on? You know, people want to build assets, so why would we not want to build the very foundation of arts and culture? So yeah.
Okay. My next question, which we've already addressed a whole lot, but I'm gonna ask Shay specifically. What things are we missing when we don't directly fund artists?
Oh, great question. I feel like I'm gonna say, so I look young thanks to this Boricua DNA, but I've been around the block a few times and I'm in my late 30s. So just like some context. So I've been on a lot of tables about funding. I've been also in hundreds of conversations with artists, and it boils down to the same thing, like what I mentioned, like trust. If we do not fund artists directly, we're contributing to inequitable systems. We're contributing to create. It's just like there's so much mediation, you know, and within all the mediation, there's people making decisions of who deserves the funding and who doesn't. And oftentimes, those conversations are lacking deep understandings of equity. And also, just like often they're tainted by these ways in which we think about capitalism and economic development from a very corporate lens. Even if people are in nonprofits, especially thinking about boards, when they are advisors, oftentimes these are people that are from the corporate sector. They have a different understanding or definition of leadership. So this connecting to, we really need to rethink how we define and see leadership in the arts. Again, an amazing example was when I was in Denver doing this grant panel, and there was one young person of color who just through their application and their project, doing photography in a rec center, like, you know, working with families in the community. It was just such a beautiful project. And just understanding that this artist, that is leadership, that is community leadership. And it actually is not too far off from the ways in which like people think of investing. When like investors talk about investing, sure, they might be like thinking about the fancy, shiny tech things, but a lot of these conversations really are about you're investing in leadership, because people want to know who is doing the work and how connected they are. Will the work be successful? Well, then let's rethink leadership in terms of artists. Like, let's rethink that and understand how the impact of community grounded artists goes beyond our often very limited understandings of economic development. Like, it's just failing. We need to rethink that. So that's one thing. The other thing is like, this conversation is so tied to labor rights. Like, still to this day, a lot of us work in relationship to institutions. Either we get contracted to do workshops or consulting or run projects, all these things. And oftentimes artists are massively under-resourced and undercompensated for the work that they do. This is something I talk a lot about in New England, where it's like specifically New England. I'm sorry, y'all, but there's a lot of wealth in New England. It's just poorly distributed, like this whole country, obviously. But, you know, like thinking about if the people who are at the helm designing these budgets, shifting their perspective again, that it's like, you are designers, you have agency, you do get to have a say. We cannot stay trapped in the patterns and little traps we make for ourselves and then pass the ball to someone else and then they feel trapped. Like, we are designers, we need to practice agency to change these systems, because we can. If we design budgets for our organizations, we can clearly allocate funding robustly to compensate artists for the work that they do. It's just real. We can do that. Do not subscribe to this belief that, oh, we're underfunded as a nonprofit, people think we have a lot of money. It's like, you know what? Because you do. And I think there's like a different understanding of like the responsibility of stewarding resources. You know, when I receive resources, to me, that's so important and meaningful. And I have to like make sure that I'm stewarding them well. And that integrity needs to exist in the foundation sector, in the nonprofit sector, and also with us as artists independently too. Like, we are accountable as well. Like, we're accountable to get out of the skin that has told us that we're not enough and that our work is not valuable. We have to pay ourselves. We have to get our artists paid. We have to advocate for these institutions to increase their budgets if they want to tap into our brilliant expertise, because they get to also apply for grants with our photos in all their marketing photos and all their marketing, right? Like, we are the success stories. So it's just like not that difficult to me. I just feel like we're so done it over, you know? I was having a conversation about in Providence, there is a foundation that started to fund white institutions to run BIPOC programming, which we're not going to get into, but it's like, sure. And let's take a breath. But, you know, the problem with that is like, we're not asking these institutions to really do the work to shift their organizational structures to be able to hold that complexity of supporting BIPOC people. Number one. Number two, still culturally specific orgs, specifically in Rhode Island. I'm only going to speak in Rhode Island, even though I see this everywhere. Culturally specific orgs are massively under-resourced, you know, and I see culturally specific orgs in the same role as me as an independent artist. Like, why are we struggling in the same way? You know, so we need to make bigger investments, because like the success of our work is wildly proven. It has been proven over decades. It has been proven throughout the pandemic, which was like one of the hardest times we've gone through as a society in our modern age. You know, like back to what you were saying, Kathy, a lot of the artists were taking center stage to hold community up, because guess what? We were isolated. We were not talking to each other. We were not engaging, and people found ways to bring back community hope and community cohesion in ways that they could. So, I mean, an example of that was like, I was able to take technology. I was able to take performance outside with the support of various community partners like the Wilbury Group. Waterfire was part of it, but the Wilbury Group was my primary partner to, in a moment in which we were in the pandemic in 2021 and approaching the elections, I mean, and the uprisings were bubbling up, the racial reckoning. I mean, everyone was like just a ball of stress and trauma and freaking out. And just taking artists down to public space, people who have a practice of performance as healing, to just get us back together, bring some hope, with the understanding that we're neighbors together. You know, when we go through hard things in our communities, we have people that have the tools and resources that they've developed that in order to help us survive and get through hard things. And that's the role of artists, you know? So like, how is that not something to be invested in? Like, just fully, you know, fully. So yeah. I think, you know, this whole conversation about equitable compensation for artists does need to be uplifted. It's definitely connected to labor rights. It's like, as gig workers, many of us, like, we don't have the same support systems as other places, so we do have to organize. So there's been some forward motion on that. Definitely in Rhode Island, there's a group of musicians and music alliance, music allies that have organized into a co-op and doing incredible work around that. So I want to see more of that. I want to see us support each other more, share resources more, and really get out of this mindset of like the celebrity artist that you were saying, Kathy. That doesn't exist. In my life, in my world, in my community, that doesn't exist, y'all. Like, I love the Astor Gates. I love these incredible artists that inspire us with their larger scale work, and they're fully funded. But our communities work different. And so can we invest in that, in the collective, and really understand that art is part of our day-to-day? Artists and cultural workers are all around us, from like the auntie who cooks a meal and invites all of us together, to like the payasa that like holds space for the young people, to like the theater workers, the poets, you know, the rappers. Like, everyone's working so hard to keep our spirits up so that we can envision possibilities beyond our challenges. And that's really what it's about, you know? And we don't just envision it now, like y'all were saying, we're building it. We've been building it. So an artist isn't just an artist. An artist is a neighbor, a cultural worker, a designer, a policy worker, a mutual aid organizer. That's what we do. So drop my mic.
I'm glad you did. Yeah, one of my favorite phrases as an arts administrator is that a budget is a moral document. And you can see what an organization or a state government or a federal government values by looking at what they're spending their money on. It's not the words, it's where the money is. And I will say this is something Shay and I talked a little bit about at the beginning of the pandemic, when we watched a lot of, particularly our larger nonprofit arts institutions locally and nationally, lay off or cancel gig worker contracts of all the artists, but all the administration still had jobs, right? And I think that relates back to something I said at the beginning, which is, as somebody who's firmly in the arts administration space, my job is to be in service of arts and artists. The artist makes the art. The administrators don't exist without that. So yes.
I want to add one more thing to that, Molly, too, because like, it really also is about courage, you know, and seeing people take positions of cowardice in moments of change is really hard. You know, like, oh, everything is we're panicking. We're going to cut off all the people that basically rely on us for sustainability. I mean, that's hard, y'all. That's like really intense. And then now with the affirmative action ruling, seeing funders too, like pause and like cut their funding. And it's like, you can't do that. You literally are like causing harm. There are ways to do that responsibly while you take a breath and recalibrate. So, you know, I think also within those spaces of stewardship of resourcing, seeing more like thoughtful leadership, and like we need people who can be calm in the storm, because we're not inventing the wheel, y'all. We forget and we stay in our little individual bubble and we think we're the ones like, you know, that have to solve everything. But all people have done this in the past. We can learn from other folks, you know? So just like uplifting that, because that was a very hard moment where institutions did that. And it also was a very important wake-up call for many of us artists. So thank you for that.
This is a great segue into the next question, which is going to go to Kathy first. And again, this is like covering some ground we've already talked about, but I'm really interested in particularly the second part of the sentence. So what are local arts agencies and state arts agencies doing right now, today, to directly fund artists? And what are we doing to increase that funding?
Thank you for that question. So I already talked about some of the programs that, well, not only have we been doing right now, we've been actually building these bridges and strategies to fund artists more directly for over a decade now. And we have an incredible team at our office. Many of the people in our office actually are individual artists who happen to work at a city government agency by day, because artists have the most brilliant creative minds in terms of how do you work around the structural things that exist while we're trying to change it at the same time. And so a lot of the things that we've been doing have really been looking at, okay, how do we do what we can do while we're trying to change the systems at the same time? And I think that's critical, because you know, we saw during the pandemic, a lot of people did these quick ad hoc things, but if you don't build the structure for it for long-term sustainability, those things quickly go away as memories are short. So you have to always be looking at how do we change the strategy. So I was a theater artist. I got hired into this job because they were looking for someone who actually had an arts background and also an organizing background. And the first thing I did was I actually asked to look at all the legislation. What are the legal parameters that the city is working through, that our office is set up for? Not because I wanted to go, okay, these are my walls, I can't go past them, but actually, as a theater artist, we're always taught to look at the conflict and then what are our strategies to get around that conflict, to work through that conflict. And so using my artist brain, looking at all the parameters that I was given, I met with a lot of community people, a lot of artists, to find out what their perceptual barriers that they thought our office was putting out to them. And then working with community, really trying to use our creative minds to, okay, how do we get past all of these barriers and work around these conflicts and actually make structural change? So, you know, just some of the basics are always be in partnership with community. It's about sharing power. We're not the experts on this. It's all of us collectively together. That's how change is going to happen. And that you have to know what you're dealing with. You have to know what the obstacle is in order to be able to work around it. So, you know, really studying, like when the first thing I was told, oh, we can only fund nonprofits. Well, I looked at the city. Every department funds individual sole proprietors and does contracts with all these different vendors. Why can't our office do that? And realize like, oh, we can. There's no restriction for us, especially as a government agency. We don't have any restrictions to only fund nonprofits. Every contract of the city is a vendor relationship with for-profits all the time. So that was like the easiest change, because there was actually nothing legal preventing that. And yet I hear that as an excuse all the time from government agencies. Oh, we can't fund individual artists because they're not a nonprofit. Yes, you know, if your city's set up the way ours is, you're funding vendors all the time. So yes, you can. You just create a different contract. So literally, it's understanding what the roadblocks are and then using our creative minds to work around them. And so, so many of the times when we've been given, or I should say, like I saw the Office for Economic Development, they've got this huge funds to do job creation. And they were given funding to actually give money out in community for job creation. And I told my director, like, that's what we do. Individual artists are, you know, sole proprietors. We should have access to that kind of funding to create that. So I was actually able to we actually were able to get money from the mayor's office to actually create this whole job creation program for individual artists. But it's really looking at what already exists in the systems and then using that to spin it in a way where they understand that artists are no different than other small businesses, sole proprietors, et cetera. So if your Office for Economic Development is already investing money in that way, then we should be able to do that for artists as well. And so it's really looking at what exists to really try to build on the existing systems while we're on the underneath foundation. How do we flip that paradigm so we can actually move closer? That was kind of a higher level response to your question, but
I think that's huge. And I think we saw a lot of that in the pandemic, is like a lot of state and local arts agencies partnering with Commerce and Department of Labor and Training, and really partnering with Department of Health. You know, one of the barriers is staffing levels in our state and local arts agencies and FTE caps. That's something we see really hard here in Rhode Island. And I know it's everywhere. It's like there's only so much you can do in a day, unfortunately. I have a note for myself in my run of show, but I think Kathy really highlighted this too. But one thing I want to shout out is that one thing that I loved during the pandemic, we and ongoing many arts administrators, many of y'all in this session have gone to the GIA Individual Artist Hive meetings. The National Assembly of State Arts Agencies has grant manager meetings. And I want to shout out one member of those meetings, the former executive director of the State Arts Agency in Montana, Tatiana Gant, who is just a force, y'all. She's so wonderful. But during the pandemic, she came to every single one of those meetings, and in every single one of those meetings reminded us, not gently, that state arts agencies can fund artists. We just can't fund fellowships using NEA money. So like there are some amazing folks who are really reminding us persistently to think creatively within the existing situation. Like, so in Rhode Island at the state level, we have a general operating support for artists. We cannot use NEA dollars or NEA match dollars. We're lucky enough that our legislature gives us more money than just the NEA match. So we can do general operating support for artists. But with the NEA money and match money, we can spend that money on project grants for artists. And we do. You know, I'm lucky enough to work in a state where we spend NEA dollars on our project grants. So there are folks, including the people in this room, but also other people who are just reminding us consistently, hey, you might think the NEA won't let state and local arts agencies use the money or the match money to fund artists. That's incorrect. That's incorrect. It just has to be project-based, and project is pretty loosely defined, y'all. So just a flag for public funders. Other thoughts, Ruby, particularly?
I mean, the one thing that I think we always forget to, you know, is how do we manipulate the system that we're in order to get to some additional results? And so one way that I think, you know, we have an opportunity is to really examine and hold accountable the organizations who are receiving unrestricted operating funds and are receiving project grants, and to what extent are we requiring meaningful compensation to the artists that are participating on the programs. Because a lot of times there's no there's no guidance, there's no expectation. If you're a small community theater and you pay, the folks on stage, sure, they're community volunteers, but maybe they're trying to be more, and $50 for a 3-week run plus 8 weeks of rehearsal and all the other time they're going to donate, that's not enough. It's not enough. And if we believe that, artists are a vital part of our sector, then we need to start prioritizing the money that we spend to them in the same way that we have these conversations about the need for gen ops for organizations. You know what? That we need to say explicitly that there has to be some level of this percentage of our budget is going to be specifically directed towards supporting individual artists, and whatever that looks like. There's so many ways to do it. And I think that time is also a commodity that we don't qualify And when we are organizing these little teeny tiny pockets, and I say teeny tiny, $500, $1,000, $5,000 buckets of money, they get maybe one shot at it. It's not nearly enough to meet the demand that exists in your community. And we ask every artist to go through that process every year for numerous, opportunities to try to cobble things together. We are taking time away from them doing their work or pursuing even more fruitful funding opportunities. So one thing we can also think about doing in terms of increasing that funding is making it easier for artists, less cumbersome for artists. One application, check all the types of support that you want for the coming year, and put that through the system. And how are we being responsive, and how are we being timely, even in the context of the grants that we're doing right now through the Craft Emergency Relief Fund, thinking about what is actually meaningful and what is helpful. The rental market is up, it's high. Folks are rethinking, especially in the craft, in the craft sector. Artists are rethinking their commitment to studios because they have to maintain a place to live. And so you've got one or the other. Basic needs, capacity building. Like, what are all these different ways that we can approach generating dollars that are more relevant and resonant with the need that the artist is communicating, instead of making assumptions? Like, I think the other thing that was so shocking at the beginning of the pandemic is that there were so many people in rooms talking about solutions and talking about, paths forward. And, has anybody spoken with an artist about any of this? Or are we just going to keep doing things the way we always do them, at people and without people, because we think we know best? And I think that has to stop. We don't know best. The artist knows best. The ultimate person who's receiving and affected by the funding and the support that we are directing, they're the ones that know best. And so back to your point, Shay, I think, the trusting of the practitioner to do their best work. Give them the money and get out of the way. And if you can't give them money directly, give it to an intermediary who's going to be held accountable and responsible for the distributing of that money to the people who need to be getting it, and you get them out of the way.
That part. Yeah, I appreciate that so much and 100% agree. Also, let's talk about format and structure of these fundings, because y'all mentioned fellowships too. Why fellowships? Like, why? Especially when it's like grant money that all of a sudden is tied to, like, wait a second, I'm gonna get $10,000, but then you're asking me to come to like between 6 or 8 workshops that are 2 hours each. I have to work. I'm supposed to now be receiving professional development to like understand how to do my work. Listen, professional development is great, but like, I think we deserve pools of funding that are not like conditional. I mean, even creative capital, like I hear so many artists complain about like that structure. They don't even apply because like it's a crapshoot, but also it's like you get a specific amount of money, but also there's all this responsibility and work that you have to do as well. So it's like, and it's tailored as like, oh, it's a resource. It's like, not really, it's our time and work and energy.
Right.
And, yeah.
And that's been recent. Like, I remember the days that a fellowship was this like big fat pot of money that just got given, and that was it. There was no strings, there was no anything to it. And now this idea that everybody has a program that's cohort driven, fellowship award, there's the commitment of time, we even administer a couple. And the big question is this really helpful? Is this really what is needed? Is this really being responsive? And how do we get to just giving the money again? Like, where we got so far away from this idea that artists are not capable and already don't come to the table, with built-in business skills. Their businesses don't look the way we understand them, but that doesn't make them any less business. And so how are we changing the way that we understand? How are we building our knowledge base? How are we holding ourselves open? Is it a risk? No. no, the risk is not making these changes and finding yourself irrelevant in 3 years and having to fight a different fight to keep hold of the money that's going to go away if these funders go away as well, right? So like there's all of these pieces that hinge together and it's frustrating.
Our office does the both and, meaning I love Irene Gomez runs our individual artist program, and she has, again, using the collective brilliance of BIPOC community and the disability community, come up with, evolved a very simple application, which actually doesn't ask the artist to even specify a project or budget or anything. It really is about talking about the artist's vision for themselves and their growth and aspirations. And from that, about 30 artists are selected each year, and they get money that they can use over a 2-year time period for whatever they want, as long as it happens in the city, because we're city government. But there are some artists who want that guidance, want to meet with other artists in a cohort model, so they have that option, and she will guide them in that way. But there are other artists who know what they want and don't need that. They have their own support mechanism, and they can do that. So they have complete freedom. And then we don't even require them to do a final report in the written sense. They have that option if they prefer that, but we also have these open share outs that she's created where they can just share with other artists, and then we take the notes, and then we enter that final report so they can meet the city requirements for them. So it's about looking at options that, again, center what makes sense for the artisan, because every artist is their own unique individual being. You can't have a one size fits all. You need something that's flexible and open to whatever they will, and we will make the bridge for what is required on the city level. And we did that actually with all of our funding programs, including organizational support ones as well.
So we're dwindling on time, y'all. So I'm going to skip some of the prepared questions and get right to the big ones, because I think, and then there's also a super compelling question in the Q&A. But I'm going to ask the big question here, which is, what things do you think that we need to do collectively to shift the value that we place on artists? And by we specifically, I mean funders, arts administrators, and folks making public policy, us in this room first. Because I feel really strongly, and Shay is like sort of a relentless advocate that pushes me all the time in the best possible ways. Because we inside this field, right, are not valuing artists. We really can't expect anybody else to. So what things do we need to do collectively to shift this value? And I'm gonna toss it to Shay first.
Cool. As an artist, I'm only gonna take a tiny piece of the labor of responding that question. Because definitely I feel like that's a question for all the folks who are in institutional space. But I'm just gonna highlight again the piece of trust, like trusting artists, talking to artists. Ruby, you mentioned that, like speaking to artists and truly listening, like not tokenizing what people say. Like if people say they need this thing, believe them. Don't go into like rooms and change the answer. And then like, it's like, it's so funny to me. It's like not that hard. If people said they need free studio space for 3 months, then, back to Kathy's point, like people are different. They have different needs. We're all humans. We go through stuff. Maybe there's an artist that needs like health, like, childcare support to be able to like do their work because they have a big exhibit coming up. So like listening and trusting and just like rethinking the role as like more stewards of resources to support people, and really getting out of this paternalistic idea that like we're parents and the artists are children and we expect them to do these things, or they have to behave a certain way to like access money or do specific things. It's like, no, we need to build more reciprocal, healthier, more joyous ways of relating to each other, because like y'all were saying, we're all in this together, and one thing is not changed by artists solely, one thing is not changed by funders solely. We just have to be building better relationships. So that's what I would center in that.
All right, Ruby and Kathy, what are your thoughts? What do we need to do?
It's we need to commit. We need to commit. We need to hold ourselves accountable and commit. If we want artists and we rely on artists and we care about artists and all of the things, then we have to commit. And it's more than just the money, it's the mindset. It's in the same way that you would call somebody out for making a discriminatory phrase, like when somebody says, oh, a starving artist, I'm like, okay, hold up, let's talk about what's in that for you. Why are you saying that? That is a trope. It is just as stereotypical as every stereotype. So why are we propagating that? There's nothing starving about artists. Artists are robust. And so let's honor that. So I think, committing, making the commitment and letting the dollars follow that commitment. It isn't just in the budget, right? Some places are going to have to bury it somehow, but document, where is that money? How is it getting distributed? Who gets to access it? And I think for me, especially in this new role, thinking about, craft, who gets to be a craft artist, who gets to say they're a craft artist, who gets to practice as a craft artist, and being able to be generous and inclusive in that definition so that folks find themselves in any way that they want to. And then we are able to provide resource and support and care and our commitment being to their well-being. And so what does that look like, and what does that mean, and what happens if we shift, to Shay's point, instead of being paternalistic, what happens if we come together as a village and we start providing, the stone soup of being able to support individual art? What do you bring? What do I bring? What are the gaps? Let's not be redundant. Let's minimize the labor. Let's not re-traumatize. Let's do all of the things, because we're willing to do all of those things to a certain extent to support organizations. And organizations are far more resourced by comparison. So why are we not willing to do that for an individual?
Yes, to all of that, and what Shay said as well. So I put into chat, like, one of the ways that, just in terms of centering the value of artists, any opportunity that I have in meeting spaces at the city, in any sector, if I'm working on climate justice is a huge thing of mine, disability justice, it's bringing artists who want to be there along, not forcing them, but it's inviting them, making the invitation. And I find so many artists are passionate about so many of these things. And when they're given an opportunity to be at the table, their brilliance and expertise shines on its own. And that then makes other people realize, oh my gosh, like, there's great ideas here, and it came from these artists. So it's really changing that framework that so many people in this country have of arts just being fluff. No, artists are actually pure brilliance and expertise, and finding value in that. It's something, a lot of us who work even in government, and we came from the arts field, a lot of us, it was really hard to say, I am also an artist. We lean into the professional hat. I've been really striving for a long time now to always mention that I'm also a theater artist, because I realize that I'm then devaluing myself in front of people and hiding the fact that my brilliance actually comes from my arts training and my artist hat, not the other way around. And one of the ways, we've really been striving to do is build relationship with community very deeply. So many of us in our office, we go to attend events created by artists, whether they're being funded by our office or not. We need to meet all the artists out there, especially the ones who have not had as much visibility as others. And so we're out there in community, meeting them at the powwows, at the different festivals, getting to know their work, because then that's how you build relationship and trust, not only us trusting them, but them trusting us. And then that way, whenever I'm in other meetings where someone's like, we need something around, I know the exact person who has that ability because I know them. I'm not always, and so we've actually piloted a number of different what we call Rainmaker funding process, where it's not about artists having to come to us and apply, but we are actually doing the research to get to know community, to get to know the connectors in community, so that we can fund them directly without even an application. And that has actually been huge, especially where we see from our data, like, oh, it's our Pacific Islander, Black, and disability artists that have gotten the least resources from our office. That's where we're going to go in and meet people in the community directly, get to know their work, and then be able to fund them because we know that they have been doing the work. And so it really is about building that relationship. And in that building of the relationship, so many times when we have conversations with artists, a lot of artists are brought up in this country where we have the internalized oppression not only of race or disability, but we also have the internalized oppression of being an artist, because artists are so not valued that it's hard for any artist to say that they're an artist. So whenever, you know, it's really about helping to show them how much we value and appreciate them, and so that we can all change our mindset collectively, because we need to value ourselves first in order to have the rest of the population realize the value that we have always played. It's undeniable how much value artists have put into this country in so many ways. The most brilliant people I've seen in almost every sector, when I drill down on their experience and get to know them, I find out that their background originally was as an artist, and then they ended up in this other sector through a wide variety of circumstances. But that brilliance showed through, and that's from the creativity they gained from their artist background.
And I think for me as a person that has a like .gov email address, something I said in a meeting a couple of months ago that I'm just like, yes, this is the thing, right? Is that I said that I wield my .gov email address like Thor's hammer, because I can get into spaces and people take me seriously in a way that, like, unfortunately and very incorrectly, and their loss, they won't take Shay seriously. But if I can get in that room, then I can get Shay in that room. And if I can get in that room as an arts administrator and as a government employee, then I can get the Department of Labor and Training to take artists more seriously and to be like, hey, maybe there's some problems with like how you're treating small businesses here, you know. And I think that being able to be in a room with government folks and non-arts folks and say, actually, artists are everywhere and you need to be paying attention and working to support them. And then when they're like, okay, well, what about this? Then you've already built those relationships with the artists themselves. Like, that's the building block of everything, to be able to suggest folks. Like, very, very recently, our Department of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, which lovely in Rhode Island, is a state level independent agency, and they're great. I was working with the folks that run the minority and women-owned business enterprise process. And they were like, you know what we really need is somebody to make videos and video editing for us. And we would love it to be somebody who is MBE or WBE certified. And I was like, great. I have a huge list of folks that can do that, who exist in Rhode Island and who don't know how to apply for WBE or MBE certification because it's a federal program and it's super hard. Let's make a deal. Let's work together here. And we did, you know, and that sort of piece is so amazing, but it's only possible because we as arts administrators, and particularly in government, have this position of power both ways. And like, that power is a huge responsibility, and it's hard. And it's incorrect that I have more power than Shay does in those rooms, but it's real. And so I just want to, like, all y'all in this room who are arts administrators and who are funders particularly, and who are working in government, you have a responsibility to wield that power like Thor's hammer, y'all. I'd love to end it on that, but there's a super compelling question in the chat that we could also spend like 4 or 5 hours talking about. And it is from Emily in Maryland, who I will say I know personally and deeply like and respect. Hi, it's good to see you. So here's a really big and hard question, and I'm going to take a stab at answering it first and then turn it over to y'all. I would be interested to know views on individual artist awards, not a fellowship, but an award based on the body of work with monetary unrestricted funding. Should this be the role of a state arts agency? So I absolutely think this should be a role of the state arts agency, but also I am a person that based on the brilliance of a working group of 10 artists who were paid for their brilliance, created a general operating support for artists program in our state. I know Maryland has one as well that is better funded than ours. And it's unrestricted, and it's based on sort of a body of work, but also a lot of future goals. But like also I say, and this is something that has come out several times in this, if we're not going to do that for artists, should we be doing that for organizations? And can you imagine state arts agencies with no general operating support for organizations? Like the larger institutions would, I can't even imagine the politically connected board members at our larger institutions if we did away with our general operating support for organizations. That same power should rest in artists, and we should value artists equally and trust them equally as we trust our large arts organizations. Because let's be honest, our large arts organizations are white and a lot of them are male. They're almost all cisgender run. I very rarely see folks with disabilities in leadership there. And that's just not true in the artist community. The artist community is very diverse, and it's easier for us to fund diverse artists than it is for us to fund diverse large institutions because of issues in the nonprofit system that disadvantage organizations that are not white. Okay, that was a lot of things I just said. Other thoughts? I have really strong feelings about this. Their opinions. Everybody else. And I can drop the question in the chat.
So I'm going to say no and push back to ask why that's the thing you think you might want to do instead of, which, you know, as Molly said, Maryland does have unrestricted artists. But I think some of the conversations that I've been a part of recently have started to shake the way that I think about artists and their work and how they represent their work and the inequities inside and inherent within, that folks who are resourced may understand what a body of work does, but that's not responsive to multidisciplinary artists. It's not responsive to culture bearers. It's not indicative of a lot of ways that I think, you know, we want people to see themselves as artists, but then we draw the line so finite that it doesn't always allow people to move in those spaces or to understand or to care why it's important to see themselves within those structures. So I think the first question being, what is it that you are giving to the community that the community is asking for? And community in this sense would be that, you know, artists and creators in the state of wherever you are, and ask them what would be a meaningful support structure. Because I think if they were to say, you know, microloans, if they were to say, you know, who knows, all these different ways of getting money into the hands of people that don't require, especially I think with awards, there's, you know, then the overlay of, you know, white Western standards, and that just, you're already moving in an inequitable system. If you're not prepared to break that down, then this is just going to be one more thing that you are going to be doing inside an inequitable system, which isn't actually going to advance anything. So I would question why you're questioning it, and then talk to the people who would be affected by it and see what they need, and can you create a program that meets that need?
We do offer unrestricted funding for individual artists awards, but it was based on meeting over, you know, with all of our BIPOC community of artists very intentionally for them to help structure what that application should look like, which is very simple. And it has them, they can share about their body of work, but it really is about their kind of what their artist vision is and what their hopeful future aspirations are. But it's not project-based. They have 2 years to decide how they're going to spend the money in any way they want. And then we on the back end, from whatever they share out, we're able to kind of help them or put together the report for them that will meet the state law standards. And then I already shared how through our organizational funding, we're funding artists who happen to have an LLC or sole proprietors, and that way they can use it for operational support or whatever they want to. And then again, on the back end, we help figure out the way to take whatever they've done in that time frame, and it's 3 years of funding that they get, and then figure out how to meet the state law, but they don't have to worry about that. We do that in partnership with them and whatever they've created.
Yeah, I think combining all of y'all's answers, because I feel like the general operating support for artists feels like really important. Specifically, I'm going to speak for artists on my scale. Like, it's really wonderful to have access to that, with the caveat of what Ruby you mentioned, like, how do we define body of work? And it's wonderful to hear Kathy, like, it was more like a non-hierarchical or like community structured process to figure out the application. But I feel like, yeah, it's like, what is body of work, and what are people's assumptions around artistic merit and artistic excellence still that are informed by still the NEA years ago? And it's like, that leaves out people who are doing b-boy competitions, folks who are hairstylists and barbers, and like, you know, all these other alternative ways in which people are creating that are rooted in community organizing, like I see all the time. And then also not forgetting that artists also end up stuck in the ceiling sometimes when they do produce a large body of work and are often creating and doing all these things. And then, you know, what do you do with those folks to make sure the ceiling can break for them? You know, that means also like offering opportunities in other cities. Like, there's other ways. It's not just like increasing funding all the time. Like, something that I've developed over time with some colleagues, Daryl Kinsel and Thomas Agnew from Pittsburgh, Black run gallery called Boom Concepts. We created a relationship that at this point has been between 8 or 10 years of artists between Providence and Pittsburgh, specifically BIPOC artists, and supporting them back and forth, you know. And we've just done that on our own as like, you know, DIY folks, artists, and arts administrators. But like, there are other ways to help artists scale their work. And I think helping us think through that and making the connections is really important. But like, yeah, so like redefining the body of work, like you were saying, Ruby, making sure the processes are like community informed, like you said, Kathy, and like really understanding the different scales in which people are operating, because we have folks that are doing a ton of work with zero resources, and we have some folks that are emerging and building new practices that should be absolutely considered artistic practice and should be funded, especially younger BIPOC folks. Because like, I feel like usually younger BIPOC folks are not the people that immediately people think to fund, but it's like oftentimes they're very expert in their communities and they know what their community needs directly, like they're at the front lines. So I think a little bit of both. I don't have answers. I'm not going to have answers because I'm an artist in this space, but I think it's really great to be open to designing and thinking things differently instead of staying stuck in like, oh, we've always done it this way. It's like, no, that doesn't get us anywhere. It hasn't gotten us anywhere. So being open to listening and showing up to a moment in time in which everything is shifting for us. Everything is shifting. Employment is shifting. The structures of safety are shifting. Politics are shifting. Technology, all these things. So we just need to try new things, you know. So yeah.
So I'm going to try and wrap us up and hand us back to Eddie because we are 5 minutes over time. So I just want to, and I will say, like, y'all, we could talk about this for hours. And I hope that we will continue this conversation and continue our advocacy to ensure that artists are at the center of the arts ecosystem. Some things that I always love to talk about and talk about more, the ways that we can subvert systems while we are trying to uncreate or recreate them, but how we can work in them and around them in the meantime. And then also this really, I think we didn't really touch on this with and it always comes up but the NEA's requirement that artistic merit be the main deciding factor in grants, and how ingenious many state and local arts agencies are right now with reinterpreting what that means and the language they use, but like, because it's happening all over the country, all in some cool ways. So I think those are like big threads to pull on in the future. Thank you all so much. I know some of us panelists are dropping our links in the chat. Please reach out. And Eddie and Grantmakers in the Arts, thank you so much for making space for this conversation. And I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. I want to say a great big thank you, Molly, Shay, Kathy, Ruby, thank you. Thank you to all of you who joined us. Thank you so much for joining us today for our summer series as part of the 2023 Grantmakers in the Arts Conference. Our next summer series session, Funding for the Culture, a Just Transition Investing Approach to Supporting Our Movements, will take place on September 20th, and we look forward to seeing you there.